I still have to make you the co-host, Carson.
Yes, we're online. I see it.
Okay. So going back to my YouTube. And then, yes. The same that I'm going to share. Okay, so welcome to our fine seminar. This is the second to last of this season. Before we get started, I just want to thank our previous speaker, Eli Strauss. He talked about nepotistic societies in hyenas. It was really cool. We learned a lot about it and about these awesome dynamics in this group that is very particular and similar to primates. Our last talk for this season is going to be presented by Geoff Weil. He's going to be talking about evolutionary ecology of family living in lizards. So a different group. So I welcome you to come and check out his talk. Just quick reminders. This is a 45 to 50 around-ish seminar. And then we have a discussion that could last up to 1 hour. So depending on how eager we are to chat. Make sure to have your microphones off during the talk, and then the questions are after we're done with the talk. And then I will send just brief instructions on the chat. So as how to type in your questions. We are implementing a new form for follow-up questions. So you just type in the question mark and FU if you want to follow up, and we'll try to keep up with that. So for today, our speaker is Dr. Erin Siracussa. Erin got her PhD in integrative biology at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada in 2018. And she's currently a postdoctoral researcher fellow at the University of Exeter in the UK. Well, her research focuses on exploring how and why social interactions change across the lifespan of organisms and how the consequences for other patterns of senescence. Erin specializes in using long-term data, especially in mammal field studies. She also uses behavioral observations and a lot of social network analysis, as you will see in her presentation. And she uses all this to prove the evolutionary basis of sociality and the consequences for health and aging. Well, if you check out Erin, she has a great publishing record for her career stage, with over 15 articles published in journals such as Philosophical Transactions, Proceedings of the National Academy, Nature, Ecology and Evolution, Animal Behavior, well, and others. And interestingly, Erin is also very committed with science outreach and has participated several times in reports for deconservation, so you can also check them out. Well, with no further ado, Erin, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and I will stop my share.
Thanks, Adriana. Let me just get my screen shared. All right. Well, hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Thanks for that really lovely introduction, Adriana. I'm really grateful for this invitation to speak as part of this really esteemed seminar series, and generally for the opportunity to be part of this really lovely community. So today I'll primarily be talking about the work that I've been doing as a postdoc at the University of Exeter, where I've been working with a long-term study of rhesus macaques to explore this intersection between sociality and aging. So as a bit of a big, broad overview, I'm really interested in trying to understand how social behaviors change across the lifespan and what the causes and consequences of those patterns of so-called social aging are. But if you'll indulge me, I'd like to open up the seminar in a bit of an unusual way by explaining how I sort of got interested in this question in the first place. And that requires me to introduce you to a very different study species, the North American red squirrel. So I entered the world of social behavior in a bit of an unusual way by studying a population of highly territorial tree squirrels. Now, this work was done as part of the Kalani Red Squirrel Project. So this is a long-term research initiative that's located in the Southwest Yukon. So here I'm giving you a bit of a view of a map of Canada, and the Carrispy study site is located where this red star is, so in the sort of furthest northwestern corner of the country. And if you've never been to the Yukon, I can assure you it's a really, really gorgeous place to work and to live. So if you ever have a chance to visit, I do highly recommend it. So this is work that was done in collaboration with my supervisor at the time, Dr. Andrew McAdam, as well as the co-PIs on the project, Stan Booten, Ben Dancer, and Jeff Lane. So just a little bit about the ecology of red squirrels, as I think it's really relevant to kind of understanding the story that I want to tell you today. So these are highly territorial animals that defend exclusive territories year-round. So at the center of a red squirrel's territory is a cache of food resources. Now, in the case of the Yukon, these food resources are white spruce cones. And this cache of food resources is called a midden. And so that's what you see pictured here. All of the sort of brown bits on the ground are part of a red squirrel's midden. And these white spruce cones are basically cached underground where they stay very cold and so are preserved for many years. So this midden is basically a red squirrel's main source of food. So these are really crucial for overwinter survival and are heavily defended. So if you were to sort of have a bit of a bird's eye view of red squirrel territories, basically squirrels occupy these abutting territories with middens roughly at the center of the territory. And because, again, these are so heavily defended, these animals rarely come into physical contact with one another outside of the mating season. But despite this, they do actually socially interact with one another all the time, primarily through vocalizations called rattles. So squirrels can obtain information about other individuals through these rattles. So that includes things like physiological state, relatedness, and familiarity. So I think all of us would kind of classically think of this species as being asocial, solitary. But I still really thought that this social environment, that is who these neighbors are, might actually be really important for red squirrel behavior and fitness. And so that's the question that I had sort of set out to ask during my PhD. And I think the results from this really astounded all of us, myself included. And in particular, what I want to share with you here are some of the results from the last chapter of my thesis. So by leveraging this really amazing long-term data set where we had 22 years of data on over 1,000 individuals, what we could show is that social familiarity with territory neighbors had really substantial fitness benefits. So we found that particularly in later life, so what we would consider to be the sort of senescent period for red squirrels, individuals who had more familiar neighbors, so these are neighbors that they had lived next to for a long time, had a higher probability of annual survival. They sired significantly more pups, and females recruited significantly more pups. So we do have some evidence for the mechanisms by which this might come about, which I don't have time to get into here, but if you're interested in it, please ask more about it later. But what I really want to point out here is, first of all, this has really exciting implications for thinking about how long-term social relationships can affect even species that we think of as being sort of asocial. But what I want to focus on for the purposes of the talk today, and what was perhaps sort of equally, if not more surprising to us, was how important these familiar neighbors were in later life, so in that senescent period. So to sort of help drive this point home, what I'm showing you here are the parameter estimates for age and familiarity in these senescent models. So in the survival model in green, the male siring success in blue, and the female recruitment in purple. And what I want you to take away from this is that in these senescent models, the effective familiarity was opposite in direction, but similar in magnitude to the effect of age in the same models. And what this seems to suggest is that familiarity could help to offset these negative effects of aging. So another way to sort of think about this is if a squirrel were to age from 4 years old to 5 years old, on average, its survival would decrease by 10%. But if that squirrel were to maintain all of its neighbors so that its familiarity increases on average by a year, its survival would actually increase by 6%. So familiarity then, that is having these sort of long-term relationships with neighbors, has potential to help buffer squirrels from these age-related declines in fitness. And it was really this result that got me thinking about, okay, so what then is the role of social relationships in this process of aging? So this figure from Nussey et al. Is now, over a decade old, but I think its message still rings true. This question of why organisms age and why they do so at different paces remains a really important, outstanding question in evolutionary biology. And if we're going to understand what drives survival and reproductive senescence, so what I'll refer to as sort of demographic senescence throughout the talk, we need to understand the traits underlying those processes. So I think in the last decade, we've no doubt made substantial progress in understanding the sort of physical, immunological, molecular traits underlying age-related demographic declines. But I would say arguably we know a lot less about how behavioral traits factor into this. And that is perhaps particularly true for social behavior. Now, to me, this is really striking. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, given the audience, but we know that social interactions are a really critical part of the environment for many species. So in humans, we know that social adversity is closely linked to health and mortality outcomes, and the effects of social isolation on mortality risk are on par with other really well-established risk factors like obesity, alcoholism, sedentary living. But of course, it's not just humans that we know this matters in. These links between social relationships and fitness have been extended across other social animals in a wide range of taxa, showing that individuals who are better connected tend to survive better, have improved health and reproductive success. So we know that there's these really clear links between social connectedness and fitness outcomes. And given this is the case, given these really well-established fitness benefits, I think understanding how and why social behavior changes across the lifespan is going to be really important, right? As it can then potentially feed back to affect senescence across different systems and tissues, and so might be an important source of unexplained variation in patterns of demographic aging. So increasingly in the last few years, I think this phenomenon of social aging, these age-based changes in social behavior across the lifetime, has really started to pique the interest of biogerontologists, behavioral ecologists, evolutionary biologists alike. So there's a growing body of literature now suggesting that older individuals tend to be less well socially connected than their younger counterparts. And we know this is true both in humans and other primates, but it's also now been demonstrated increasingly in a wide range of other taxa. So this includes species such as red deer and marmots, in lions, in vultures, and in beetles, for any of you who tuned into Vince Formica's talk a few weeks ago. So this suggests that social aging might be widely conserved across the animal kingdom and quite a ubiquitous phenomenon. But I think at the outset, these sort of social declines seem likely to be detrimental for late life health, given what we know about these connections between being well socially connected and fitness outcomes. But arguably, I think we need to understand what the drivers of these changes are if we're going to understand their late life consequences. And so this is some of the work that I've been trying to do as part of my postdoc here in Exeter, is to lay out some of these different potential explanations for patterns of social aging. So to kind of broadly categorize these for the purposes of this talk, I think on one hand, we can think about reductions in numbers of partners with age being brought about by sort of physical, energetic, or cognitive deterioration with age. And all of these might sort of inhibit the ability of individuals to socially interact, or it might lead to older individuals being sort of less desirable social partners. And if this kind of loss of social capital leads to loss of access to resources, then this might sort of further reduce fitness and exacerbate the rate of senescence. But alternatively, changes in social behavior with age could result from individuals adjusting their behavior in ways to help compensate for some of these negative effects of aging. Or there are other sort of positive effects that come with age, like enhanced knowledge or experience that might sort of shape individuals' social worlds or social behavior as they get older. So there might therefore be sort of potential for social aging to actually enhance late life fitness and dampen senescence. So I think teasing apart these different drivers of social aging is going to be critical if we're going to further our understanding of sociality in the aging process. So one of these explanations in particular that there's been a sort of growing body of literature around is this idea of increased selectivity with age, whereby sort of declines in number of social partners with age results from individuals kind of pruning their social networks to focus in on important partners. So this idea has its roots in what's called socio-emotional selectivity theory in humans, which basically posits that these changes with age are kind of the result of this awareness of limited time left in life. And that leads individuals to sort of prioritize the most important emotionally salient relationships. But recent research has also begun to demonstrate evidence of that is at least suggestive of these patterns of social selectivity in non-human primates that do not, at least to the best of our knowledge, have this awareness of limited time. So it suggests that maybe there are some deeper biological roots to this phenomenon. So I think these studies have provided a really important foundation for our understanding of social selectivity in non-humans, but where I think one of the major limitations of these studies to date has been that they're primarily cross-sectional in nature, meaning they observe different individuals in different age classes. And that makes it really hard to know whether those purported age-related changes are actually due to aging per se, or are the result of processes like selective disappearance. So in this figure, for instance, it might appear that sociality increases with age simply because less social individuals, like the blue individual here, die earlier. They selectively disappear from the population. But if we were actually to look at the within individual level, we would find a very different pattern. So what we really need to demonstrate social selectivity then is that there is a within individual change in behavior across the lifetime. And this is something that has been widely appreciated in aging studies broadly to date, but its application in studies of social aging has sort of lagged. Okay, so this is where I could really capitalize on a really nice long-term system, Caio Santiago, where we have longitudinal data to actually test this hypothesis that rather than social declines being driven by senescence per se, the individuals might be sort of actively narrowing their networks to their closest friends. So this is work that was done in collaboration with my current supervisor, Lauren Brent, and the other PIs on Caio, James Hyam, and Noah Snyder-Mackler. So for those of you who don't know Caio Santiago, this is an island off the coast of Puerto Rico that is home to about 1,500 free living rhesus macaques. So these animals were first brought to the island in the late 1930s and have since then been allowed to sort of freely associate into mixed sex socials. These animals are food supplemented and provided ad libitum access to water. There's no natural predators on the island, and there's no veterinary intervention. So deaths in this population are from natural causes like illness and injury. These animals are individually recognizable, so we can identify them based on their facial characteristics, but also based on tattoos and ear notches. So given this, we can follow these individuals daily and gather information about their affiliative and agonistic interactions. And because we follow them on a daily basis, we know births and deaths with a high degree of accuracy, so we have really rich life history data. So for the purposes of the studies that I'll tell you about today, I'm going to focus in on social networks that I built basically using data across 8 years and 6 social groups. So you can see the social groups here indicated by these different colors, and you can see that they're sampled for different lengths during the 8 years of the study. I focused here on social networks built from adult female macaques age 6 to 28. So the sort of max age in this population is about 30. And I recorded built networks basically using 2 different types of social interaction data. So we record data on grooming interactions, and we also record data on time spent in proximity. So these are instances where individuals are sitting within 2 meters of one another. And these are both metrics that are widely used to characterize affiliative social relationships in primate species. Okay, so to help disentangle social selectivity from some of these other non-mutually exclusive causes of social aging, I derived and tested sort of 4 predictions. So the first is perhaps quite obvious. I expected that social networks would actually narrow with age. So individuals would interact with fewer partners as they got older. Secondly, I predicted that this network narrowing would be driven by the aging individual itself rather than by others withdrawing from interaction with that older individual. Third, I expected that the aging individual would show continued engagement and interest in the social world. And the idea here was to help disentangle social selectivity from a sort of narrowing of networks with age that might result from declines in social interest or motivation or the sort of physical ability to engage. And fourth, I was predicting that aging individuals would focus in on important relationships with age. So you're probably asking, okay, but what are important relationships? And for this study, we define this as kin, as strongly connected partners. So these are individuals with whom females interacted with frequently in past years, and stable partners. So these are individuals with whom females were partners with for at least 2 consecutive years. And these are all partners that are known to carry important fitness benefits for females in this population. And just as a brief note, to basically disentangle social plasticity, these within individual changes from selective disappearance, I used a within individual centering approach for all of these analyses. I won't go into detail about that here, but if you want to hear or talk more about what that is, please ask me about it later. Okay, so what do we actually find? So just to start by orienting you to these figures and those that will come after. So here in these figures, each data point is an individual female year. The solid black line shows the average predicted within individual change with age, and each of these differently colored slopes represents the inter-individual variation in that slope. So we saw that females reduced their number of grooming partners as they got older, and they reduced their number of partners that they spent time sitting near. And this latter effect was most pronounced in low-ranking females. So generally, that seems to support our first prediction. Individuals are interacting with fewer partners as they get older. We found that this reduction in network size seemed to be driven by the aging females. So females reduced the number of partners that they approached with age. And again, this effect was most strong in low-ranking females. But females continued to be approached by similar numbers of partners. So suggesting that this narrowing of networks is not driven by the sort of social withdrawal of others or their unwillingness to interact with the aging females. Regarding, support for sort of our second prediction there. Regarding kind of interest or engagement in the social world, we saw no changes in the amount of time that females spent giving grooming, receiving grooming, and no changes in the amount of time that females spent in proximity. So this suggests that sort of social effort and engagement doesn't decline with age, despite the fact that females have fewer partners. They're just sort of reinvesting that effort in this sort of core group of individuals. So that supports our third prediction. And finally, when we looked at whether females were focusing in on important relationships as they age, we found that females increased their proportion of kin partners as they got older. We also found that in later life, females had a higher probability of being partners with individuals who they had been strong strongly connected to in previous years, and individuals who had been stable partners in previous years. So as they get older, females are emphasizing kin, strong and stable connections. So again, that seems to support our fourth prediction. So taken together, we had good evidence to support all of these predictions, suggesting that females might be sort of actively narrowing their networks and perhaps beneficially adjusting their social behavior as they get older. Now, for me, all of this sort of accumulating evidence that there are these changes in social behavior and relationships with age raised an important question about whether these age-based changes in behavior could scale up to affect the wider social network. So just as a really brief primer for anybody who might not be familiar with social networks here. So here the nodes in the network represent the individuals, and the lines between individuals represent the strength of social connections between partners, where these sort of thicker lines or edges represent partners that might groom, for instance, more frequently, and then partners here with thinner edges that might groom less frequently. So what I was interested then is in whether these changes in who an individual interacts with directly with age, so who they groom or who they sit near, which I've just shown you that this does change with age, could those changes actually scale up to influence an individual's connectedness to the partners of their social partners, or what we would call sort of indirect connectedness in network terms. So this tells us something about how well individuals are embedded in the wider social sphere. So this is a question that I worked on in the cow macaques in collaboration with Andre Pereira and Josephine Bora-Brask. And one of the interesting effects that we found that I want to sort of hone in on today is that a metric called closeness tends to decline with age. So this is a measure of how easily individuals can reach or be reached by others in the network. So what seems to be happening then is basically by sort of trimming their weak or peripheral connections as they age, females are reducing their connectedness to the wider network. Now, we know that indirect connectedness is really important for the flow of goods through a network. So this is likely to have really important effects on limiting things like the spread of disease, but on the flip side, could also reduce the transmission of important information like social knowledge. So now we've seen that changes in direct connectedness can affect how an individual is embedded in the wider network. But ultimately, I wanted to ask, okay, how do these individual level changes scale up to affect the overall structure of the network? So that is, when you've got lots of old individuals in a network, how does network structure begin to change and potentially break down? So in the same paper, we also looked at changes in network structure with changes in the proportion of old individuals in the group. So the first network metric that we looked at here was something called mean degree. So this measures basically the average number of ties that each individual has to others in the network. So this provides sort of a measure of overall network connectedness. And we predicted that this would decline with greater proportions of old individuals in the group. But in the empirical data, we didn't find any strong evidence to support that prediction. We also looked at a metric called diameter, which basically measures the number of steps needed to get from individual A to individual B in a network. So it provides a measure of sort of network cohesiveness. So a network with very low diameter, it takes very few steps to get from this red to this blue individual. And so this is a very sort of well-connected, cohesive network. Whereas a network with very large diameter, it takes many steps to get from the red to the blue individual. So this is a much more poorly connected, much less cohesive network. So here we expected network diameter would increase with a greater proportion of old individuals. But again, in the empirical data, didn't find any strong evidence to support this. So no clear changes in network connectedness or cohesion with greater numbers of old individuals in the group. Okay, that's a bit surprising. What's going on here? We thought it would be quite intuitive that individual changes would scale up to sort of network changes, that these individual changes in behavior with age would actually scale up to network changes. So our main thought here is that, okay, well, maybe our sample size is too small. 19 networks over 8 years represents a considerable amount of time and effort, but may not actually be enough to detect an effect. Alternatively, maybe there's not enough variation in the proportion of old individuals in the network. So in our data, this proportion of old individuals range from about 4% to 20%. So to try to assess this, we ran some simulations, and I'll try to be brief here for the sake of time. But basically, what we could do is we could parameterize our simulations based on the CHI of Santiago data. So we simulated groups of 50 females, which is the average female group size on CHI. And we included kin structure in these simulations. So that's what you see in these differently colored nodes. And then we were able to vary the proportion of old individuals in the group between 0 and 1. And then we ran these simulations 100,000 times, so meaning we created 100,000 networks. And when we did this, we found that we could recover quite clear effects of the proportion of old individuals on network structure. So I think you can see this effect visually quite well here. These networks with just young individuals, which are the triangles here, are really quite dense and well connected, while the networks with just old individuals are much more sparse and less cohesive. So this is also reflected in these network metrics that we were interested in. So we see clear declines in mean degree with greater proportions of old individuals in the group and increases in network diameter. So this suggests that at least in these simulated data where we had greater proportions of old individuals and a larger sample size, that networks do show clear declines in connectedness and cohesion with greater proportions of old individuals. So even though we didn't detect these effects in our empirical data, I think it suggests that age demography has the potential to have important influences on network structure in real-world systems. And I think it's worth noting that there is some empirical evidence to support this. So if you tuned in a couple weeks ago to Vince Formica's talk, you might have heard a bit about this. So some recent work led by Phoebe Cook and co-authors has shown that in burying beetles, these old populations, they could actually manipulate the composition of these groups, and the old populations have sparser, more variable ties and longer path lengths between individuals than the young populations. Okay, so why do we care? Well, I would argue that aging populations are a serious concern. By 2050, the proportion of the world's population over 60 is expected to nearly double. And it's not just humans that this is likely to affect. There's evidence that some animal populations are getting older as well. So for instance, in this population of elk, we can see that the proportion of senescent individuals, these light gray bars, is increasing with time. And these lines show that the median or mean age of adults is increasing. Given that we know social behavior changes with age, and this appears to be quite ubiquitous across species, this sort of shifting age demography of populations is potentially going to have really important influences on social network structure. And that in turn, I think, has broad consequences for a variety of ecoevolutionary dynamics, including things like information transfer, collective movement, decision-making and cooperation, and disease transmission. So I think taken together, these effects on network structure could be a kind of previously unappreciated pathway by which age demography can affect population dynamics and persistence that perhaps warrants more research and consideration. Okay, so let's sort of summarize where we're at so far. So I've given you what I would argue is sort of the most conclusive evidence to date for social selectivity in a natural population. I think this adds to a growing body of evidence suggesting that these sort of reductions in number of social partners with age is maybe not exclusively a consequence of senescent declines, but that older individuals might alter their social choices to cope with new challenges or take advantage of new opportunities in later life. And we found that these changes at the individual level can scale up to affect an individual's connectedness to the wider network and ultimately the structure of the network itself. But while I think we've added some context and nuance to understanding how individual social worlds change with age and who is driving those changes, I think there is an important question that still remains, which is why reduce your network size and be socially selective with age? So I think one important limitation or challenge that animals are likely to face as they get older is immune decline. So immunosenescence, we know, is a well-established phenomenon across the animal kingdom, as this meta-analysis by Peters et al. Very nicely shows. So I think one compelling possibility is that this immunosenescence could lead individuals to withdraw from social interactions to minimize disease risk in late life when they're least sort of able to cope with it. Now, we know from some very nice work led by my colleague Mitchell Sanchez Rosado that there is clear evidence of immunosenescence in the rhesus macaques of Cayo, with signs of reduced adaptive immunity with age, as well as greater inflammation and immune dysregulation in older individuals. So this suggests that there is at least potential here for these late life immune changes to drive changes in social behavior with age. So given these patterns of social aging, we could use the system to test how these age-based changes in behavior influence disease spread. So to do this, I worked with Matt Silk and Melissa Pavez-Fax, who are really the disease and modeling experts of this study. So feel free to throw some epidemiological questions at me later. I'll do my best to answer, but these guys were really the experts here. So basically, we built our grooming networks using the cow data, and then we simulated the spread of a hypothetical directly transmitted pathogen. So you can think of this as a respiratory virus like COVID through these networks. So in these networks, the probability of transmission was dependent on the edge weight, right? So individuals with stronger edges were more likely, or more frequent interactions were more likely to be infected. And for each day that they are infected, individuals pay a certain cost of infection. And at the end of those 500 time steps, then, we wanted to know what was the accumulated cost of infection for each individual. So this depended on a few things. It depended on an individual's probability of infection, the severity of infection, and the duration of infection. And we allowed these different parameters to vary with age. So for different runs of this model, we either had conditions where we had no immunosenescence, so all of those parameters remained consistent for all ages. We had conditions where we allowed for infection susceptibility, so that's the likelihood of acquiring an infection to increase with age. Conditions where we allowed for infection severity, that's how costly the infection is per day or per time step to increase with age. And conditions where we allowed for infection duration to increase with age. So that's the number of time steps that the infection lasts. And we had different combinations of these sort of immunosenescence parameters. So all of these parameters were based on what we know about immune declines with age in rhesus macaques from clinical studies. Okay, so as a reminder, our hypothesis then was that the lower social connectivity of older individuals that we've demonstrated in this population would protect them from infection costs. So we can start by examining the results from our models just by looking at how infection cost changes with age. So here I'm showing you the predicted relationship in a model with just infection cost as the response and age as the predictor for different types of immunosenescence. So there's a couple things to note here. So first of all, when there's no immunosenescence, or we only allowed for increases in infection susceptibility with age, so that's the purple and blue lines here, infection cost actually decreases with age. Under cases where we allowed for increases in infection severity, so that's the green line, and duration, the yellow line with age, we do see increases in infection cost with age. So one way to ask whether these declines in sociality could be reducing infection cost in older individuals is to see what happens to this predicted relationship between infection cost and age when we add sociality to the model. And in all cases, we find that when sociality is now controlled for, these slopes, this relationship between cost and age actually increases. So this suggests then that sociality is having an important buffering effect on age-based infection cost. So we can think about this difference between these slopes then as the sort of protective effect of social aging. And to get a better sense of when social aging is most important, we can plot this protective effect under these different immunosenescence conditions. And that's what I'm showing you in this plot on the right. So I think the first thing to note here is that this protective effect of social aging is negative in all cases, meaning that having lower sociality at old ages reduces infection costs under all of the conditions that we modeled. But it's particularly protective when there are increases in infection severity with age, which is what you see in the green bar here. Now, this is all much more complicated than I have time to tell you here. This really depends on a variety of different things, including transmissibility, which we varied. So if you want to hear a bit more about that, please feel free to ask later. So if we zoom in on just one of these models, we can look at how the different social metrics that we were interested in contribute to this protective effect. So what I'm showing you here are the results for basically two important metrics that we know decline with age in this population. So number of partners, which is degree in network terms, and connectedness to the wider network, or closeness in network terms. And what you see in each of these figures is the effect of age on infection costs and how this depends on social connectedness. So the very dark purple here is very high connectedness, and the yellow is very low connectedness. And the main takeaway here is that, especially for closeness, so this plot on the right, having lower social connectedness, so look at the yellow line, tends to reduce infection cost, and under all conditions, under all ages, but this is particularly true under old ages. So just for the sake of making this a little bit more interpretable, basically we can translate infection costs into number of infections. So at 8 years old, having average closeness rather than high closeness results in 2 fewer infections across the duration of the simulations. Whereas at 18 years old, having average closeness rather than high closeness results in 4 fewer infections over the duration of the simulations. So basically, having reduced closeness has basically double the protective effect at older ages. Okay, so a bit of a summary from this section. So I've shown you that reduced sociality when older can protect individuals from at least simulated infectious disease risk. Now, these protective effects of social aging do depend in really complex ways on the epidemiological characteristics, which I've only skimmed the surface on, but do seem to be greatest when infection severity increases with age. I think one of the really important points from this is that the changes in connectedness to the wider network seem to have the most potential to provide protection against disease risk in later life. And that means that we should really be thinking about how aging shapes indirect as well as direct connectedness if we're going to understand the full sort of ecoevolutionary implications of social aging and what might drive social aging. So what do I hope you'll sort of take home from what I've shared with you today? I've shown you that social behavior can change across the lifespan, and so maybe an important and underappreciated aspect of the aging phenotype that warrants a bit more attention. I've given you evidence that these behavioral changes that happen at the level of the individual can scale up to affect the network, and this might have really broad consequences for the ecoevolutionary dynamics of aging populations. Now, importantly, I think understanding how and why social aging occurs is going to be critical if we're going to understand the late life consequences. So I've shown you that these declines in sociality are not necessarily detrimental, but might actually reflect strategies to help compensate for the negative effects of senescence. But I think, of course, to truly test this, we need to understand what the fitness outcomes associated with social aging are. So that is, we need to sort of close this loop, and we need to ask, how does social aging feed back to influence late life health and demographic aging? And so this is the next step that I'm really hoping to take with this research. I'm looking for funding to work with Dan Nussey and Matt Silk to ask these questions in the soy sheep system. And for any of you who don't know about the soy sheep system, this is really an excellent model system for studying aging. So some of the preliminary analyses that I've done in this system have shown that social relationships do carry important fitness benefits, particularly that having sort of strong connections to key partners improves survival in female sheep. I don't have time to sort of get into the details of these results today, but if you're interested in sort of learning more about what we found, I encourage you to check out a recent preprint on this. But in addition to sort of the fitness benefits of sociality, we have at least some very preliminary evidence that there are declines in quantity of social partners with age. So here this is operationalized as mean group size, but we see similar patterns when we look at network metrics like degree. And so this aligns with many other studies on social aging across taxa. So taken together, my hope then is to be able to use this system where we have 40 years of data on over 8,000 individuals and a 14-generation pedigree to be able to ask, what are the early life and genetic drivers of inter-individual variation in social aging trajectories? And ultimately, how does this influence late life health and demographic senescence? So with that, I just need to say a really big thank you to everyone who has been involved in this work. I think research is made so much richer by working with amazing collaborators, and this work wouldn't have been possible without all of the amazing teamwork that's been done. So a big thank you to Matt Silk, Melissa Pavis-Fox, Andre Pereira, and Josephine Borbrask. A special thank you to my supervisor, Lauren Brent, who's been really instrumental in the development of all of these ideas, and the PIs on CAIO, James Hyam and Noah Snyder-Mackler. And I'd be remiss if I didn't offer a huge shout out to our field technicians, our research assistants, Daniel Phillips and Josue Negron, who have boots on the ground, 24/7, and are collecting all of the behavioral data. This work is not possible without their hard work. So yeah, thanks for listening, everyone, and happy to take questions. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Erin, for such a great talk. We learned a lot, and it was amazing. So we open the floor for questions. Just a reminder, introduce yourself, just say your name and your affiliation, and if you want to share what are you working on, that'll be great. We're trying to build community and to keep our community strong. So if you have any question, just type in your question mark. And for the people on YouTube, just type in your question on YouTube and we'll make sure to bring in here. Okay, we have a first question from Sari.
Hello, I'm Sari van Belle and I study black howler monkeys in Mexico. And some of these monkeys are getting old as well, like 24 or something like that. And I also recognize that they do strange stuff in that they stop following the group they belong to and then disappear. And so we don't know what happens to them because they disappear, but it's odd. But this is just black howler things. My question is about your network analysis, looking at whether the proportion of older individuals affect the form and the network of kind of the design of like how it looks like these. But then in real life, you're using real networks and the real population, you didn't see an effect. So then you continued on stimulating these effects and looking how these networks were altered and seeing then that these were altered, which isn't surprising because you had up to the whole population being old females. Mm-hmm. And then you said that this reflects real world social systems, which I think it didn't because you stimulated them. And so actually my question is, at what proportion of the population do you really start seeing these effects in the networks? Because it would be kind of exaggerating thinking that a population exists of only old individuals. Perhaps humans will never reach that, but we are an extreme example because we have medicine and whatnot. So that's kind of my question. Is it such that these networks really change even though you have old individuals?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry. Thank you for that question. I think it's really important. And it's something I did skim over for the sake of time, but is worth, discussing in a bit more detail. So first of all, I just want to make sure I didn't sort of cause any misunderstanding. I totally agree with you that these are simulated networks, so they are not, they're based on real world networks, but they do not necessarily reflect real world networks. And you're absolutely correct that, I don't know under any conditions are we going to see the proportion of old individuals that are actually necessary to detect these effects on network structure. It's a really important question. And I think part of what those, maybe I can share my screen again briefly. Let me just see if I can pull up that slide. Because one of the things that I skimmed over a little bit, which I do think is interesting and relevant from the simulations and why they are useful, is, give me 1 second here. Okay. Let me share this slide. Is that you can see that there is some nonlinearity in these patterns, right? So I think in particular, if we're looking at diameter, it's maybe a bit more obvious that as you get towards the sort of tail end of this distribution, that this proportion of old individuals, around maybe over 50% is where that you start to see a sort of stark increase in diameter. And so I agree with you that what that might suggest is, are these effects mostly going to be detectable in really old populations where we never actually see that in the wild? And my answer is I just don't know. Some of this might point to that question that, maybe. Like I said, there is some evidence from the burying beetle work that I mentioned that Vince talked about a couple weeks ago, but those were also manipulated group compositions, right? So it's still not real world networks. I don't know if, I don't know what sort of proportion of old individuals get up to in the wild. So I think it's an open question. I think it is interesting and relevant that there's potential here for age-based changes in individual behavior to scale up, but when that actually applies to real world systems has yet to be determined.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sari. So I'm going to call Will. Sorry, I'm skipping one, but Will is a student and he marked it down. So Will.
Thank you so much for the great talk. A lot of the stuff that you're showing was really exciting. My name is Will Rogers. I'm a PhD student at Yale University under Vanessa Ezenwa. I read your sheet preprint and it was really exciting because a lot of the same directions of effects that you're finding are things that we're seeing recapitulated, like the buffalo social networks. But my question, one of the things that I was really excited about in the beginning of your talk was this idea that like rank determines the relationship between like as you age, how are you approaching other females and that kind of stuff. And I feel like it kind of gets into, there's a question in the chat about like cortisol, but then also this idea of like resource availability, this like what are you actually gaining from your connections, about information and resource access, et cetera. But so just kind of like wondering what your thoughts were about this idea that aging doesn't maybe affect all individuals the same way socially. And then is that kind of like a cause and effect thing in the sense of like, are individuals who are high rank just able to get everything they need from their social environment no matter what? Like just kind of like, what are your thoughts there about like how that rank plays into the physiology underlying social aging? Or is it that the behavior is driving a lot of those physiological impacts?
Oh God, it's a really good question. I think, well, for starters, I think this whole behavior physiology, how these things are intertwined is really important and really interesting and so hard to disentangle. But yes, I think this question about what's going on with rank is a really valid one. And oh God, I'm so sorry. I feel like I'm going to be doing a lot of this of just resharing slides. Let me just pull up another slide that might be useful to help us talk about this. So I feel like I should just keep sharing my screen. Okay, so a little bit about what we know about low-ranking individuals in this population, which maybe will give us some insights into what's going on. So we know that low-ranking individuals do exhibit greater increases in inflammatory cells with age. So that's what you're seeing sort of in the figure down here. So they have sort of stronger immunosenescence. And we also know that they're more likely to be injured. So older low-ranking individuals are more likely to be injured. So I think stronger declines in sociality with age among low-ranking individuals could be a response to mitigate this risk of injury and the associated costs given their immune compromised state. But it's also possible that sort of low-ranking individuals experience more rapid senescence due to greater adversity, and that might accelerate declines of sociality with age. I think it's, you know, what my results have pointed toward are that it's not just a consequence of senescent declines, that there seems to be something else going on, but it's very hard to be absolutely confident about exactly what is driving those changes. And I think both those things are going to be interacting in some ways, right? So it might be that they are sort of physiologically limited more so than high-ranking individuals. But are they able to sort of adjust their behavior in a way that allows them to compensate more for some of those physiological limitations? Maybe is what the results seem to suggest. Yeah. Hopefully that answers your question, but really good question.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Will. Well, we have another student question from Karen.
Yeah. Hello. Good morning. Well, I'm a biology student from Colombia, and have a very kind of interesting question. So I wanted to ask, how do younger individuals come to exhibit this social selectivity once they age up? Can this be driven by some kind of genetic predisposition, or is something they learn by simply observing their older specifics?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is, I have no idea yet. It's totally possible that there is a genetic basis to this. And that's sort of partly what I'm hoping I can get at in the sheep system that I want to work on. We know that aging, there's not a lot of evidence, but there is some evidence to suggest that aging rates are heritable. And there is one paper published last year that shows that this does seem to be true for social aging as well. So that was, I'm going to forget the species of bird. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. But anyway, I could share that paper with you if you're interested, Karen. But so anyway, I think that suggests that maybe there's potential for these sort of patterns to be heritable, but we know very little about that yet. So it's, yeah, open question.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. I'm going to call Michael.
Yes, thank you very much. Michael Taborski, University of Bern. I'm interested in social evolution. You showed quite convincing evidence that social aging can be adaptive, or that it can compensate, as you formulated it, for negative consequences of senescence. But this was, of course, physical senescence. So my question is whether you have any data or whether there exists any evidence in animals that it has also any positive effects in compensating for cognitive senescence effects, cognitive costs. Because thinking of humans, I think this is a very clear potential factor that could relate to social aging.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It's a good question. So I certainly don't have any evidence currently. I think it's yeah, I think certainly cognitive changes are going to play into this as it's sort of one of the different explanations, when I was laying out sort of those different explanations for why social aging may occur. Cognitive changes could limit individuals' ability to sort of recognize individuals as they get older, and sort of focusing in on key partners might be, like, as you're sort of speculating, a compensatory mechanism where if you're just bad at recognizing or remembering who's who, if you're really focusing in on just those key partners that you know and you remember well, that maybe that's a way of being able to continue to socially interact with limited cognitive capacity. So I don't think that the results we have necessarily rule out that it could be sort of to compensate for cognitive declines rather than just physical declines, right? But I don't have any strong evidence to suggest at this point that it is one or the other.
Mm.
That's sort of what you were getting at with the sort of compensating for cognitive declines.
Yeah, whether there is any data in animals that would suggest that cognitive costs are sort of compensated by social aging by reducing your number and amount of social interactions with others in your social network. I think this is probably, at least in humans, it appears to be a quite likely cause. And even if it's a constraint to have cognitive senescence, there could be compensatory mechanisms by reducing your number of social interactions, interaction partners, things like that.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That, like, yeah, if you are constrained by how many partners you can remember, well, you're doing the best of a bad job effectively by choosing the partners that you get along with best, that give you the most support, so, but yes, not that I can think of offhand. Could be that it's eluding me at the moment, but I don't know that there's any evidence of that currently. Certainly a hypothesis out there, but don't know.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to skip myself and call Natalie. And then, Karsten, I'll call you for the YouTube question after Natalie.
Yes, two YouTube questions. Actually, one is from Natalie with the same last name, so maybe it's the same, and the other one is for Nina Trufas. So I start with the question from Nina. She asks, or she says, "Hello, thanks a lot for your great talk. Do you have explanations for why other species than humans experience increased proportion of older individuals?" I think that was this elk example. You showed also getting more old animals in the population. An explanation for that.
Sorry, Kristen, can you maybe just repeat an explanation for why species other than humans have more?
Yeah, I mean, you showed this graph that in humans are getting old on average in the future, and that this is not only the case for humans, but I think there was an example of elks or something like this. Why does it also happen in other species sometimes? That's how I understand it.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Good question. It's a good question. I don't know offhand why. I don't remember from that paper why, or if they even know exactly why the proportion of old individuals falling fertility rates, which could be the result of sort of anthropogenic changes or things like this, would be my initial guess. Of course, I think it's important to say that I was really focused on looking at this from the angle of thinking about what happens when you have more old individuals in a population. But this question holds true even if we're thinking about what happens when you're losing old individuals, which is maybe something that's easier to think about, with sort of trophy hunting and those sort of dynamics. that you might get shifts in the age demography of populations towards younger populations. And that's also going to have consequences. Again, if there are age-based differences in social behavior, that's also going to have consequences for social network structure. It just, the consequences might be very different. You know, if you have very young populations that are really well connected, then maybe disease is going to spread super fast through those networks. So no, sorry, I don't really have a great answer to that question. But I think, yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's anyway not a general trend, but with so many populations, you will always have some where the age structure changes like this. And over evolutionary time, it might happen to all populations, so they might have some mechanisms.
Yeah.
So the second question comes from Natalie Galindo. She asks, oh, there comes some message in here. How are the benefits of social life, such as grooming, conflict support, or alliances, balanced against the risk of infection as macaques age?
Yep. Yeah, that's a great question. So this sort of, yeah, social buffering, if you will. And we definitely have some evidence to suggest that this kind of social buffering might be happening in the macaques. Specifically, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember the results exactly, but I think we have results from some of Melissa's work that more integrated individuals have sort of reduced white blood cell counts, so reduced inflammation, yeah, and low status individuals as well, from some of Mitchell's work, that low status individuals tend to have higher levels of inflammation. So clearly there is some benefit of being well connected or being high ranking for immune protection. So that's not something that we modeled explicitly, which it's something that we talk about in the paper as a potential extension for future research. And I think would be really interesting to sort of model that more explicitly. I think one of the things that's interesting about those results, which I didn't really get into for the sake of time, is one of the things that we found is that decreases in the strength of social connections with age, so how frequently you're interacting with your partners, would have really substantial benefits for reducing cost of infection. But despite that, if you remember from the results I first showed you, we see that individuals reduce their numbers of partners. And that means that they're reducing their connectedness to the wider network, but they're retaining strong connections to those individuals. So I think this maybe speaks a little bit to this trade-off between the benefits of social connections and the drawbacks of infection that you might get from those connections, that individuals could be reducing their infection risk even further if they were to reduce their strength of connection. But because those social relationships are still so important and potentially providing some benefit, that they're sort of trading off, okay, I'm going to retain my strength of connection to some key individuals, but by reducing the number of partners, and in doing so, reducing their connectedness to the wider network, that is at the same time allowing them to sort of reap the benefits of reduced infection risk.
Great. And Nina writes, thank you in the chat for your answer to the first question.
Thank you, Carsten. I will skip again myself and I will read Juan's question. Or maybe you want to read it as well, Erin. So how do you think hormones like basal cortisol might relate to aging phenotype? If they change over time, could this represent one of the motivational bases for changing social behavior along with immunological cost?
Sorry, I'm just reading along with you. Okay, yeah, so interesting. I don't know if I've spent much time thinking about cortisol. So this is not something that like immediately jumps to mind as to how this might play a role. I think I find cortisol to be I find thinking about stress in general to be a tricky one here, because Social, I mean, I don't, I think the answer is I don't know. Sorry, Adriana, were you going to say something?
I was just gonna say maybe like if there is in young individuals, if there are some individuals that have a more stressful phenotype, would they age faster and probably their networks will shrink faster than a non-stressed individual? I don't know. Maybe that's the way that Juan was kind of thinking. Juan, if you want to jump in, you can also talk in Spanish and I can do the translation if you want.
Yeah, I think, okay, so it's possible. I guess I struggle a little bit with the stress angle because, yeah, maybe if we're talking about individuals who are chronically stressed, so maybe this goes back a little bit to the question that Will posed about, yeah, sort of, low-ranking individuals who we might think about being sort of chronically stressed. Because, right, I think the part of what I struggle with here is that stress, can be adaptive, right? You are stressed for a reason. You're stressed. You're being, stress is, the sort of mechanism that's keying you into saying, I need to go and find some friends. But yeah, obviously being chronically stressed is not a good thing. So yeah, maybe this sort of idea of being chronically stressed, like you were saying, Adriana, is, yeah, going to lead individuals to have sort of fewer, so faster physiological declines, and that might sort of precipitate either faster social declines, or if individuals are able to do sort of the best of a bad job, then maybe they can compensate by being selective in who they're interacting with. So yeah, maybe it does relate back to what Will was sort of talking about in his question as well. Sorry, that wasn't a super clear answer. That's a tricky one.
Yoda. Hello, thank you. This point is very difficult to me to think, but I think that hormonal stress is a sign of performance. For example, individuals maybe give a reconciliation, and aging females maybe more more qualitative social. Excuse me.
No, it's okay. Take
Yeah,
your time.
the idea is social focusing in older females, and what they do, they maybe are more reconciliatory individuals, more very good performance to give post-affiliative post-conflict affiliative interactions, and the basal cortisol may be a landmark of this performance. This is my point of view.
So if I'm following you correctly, Juan, then you're sort of suggesting that maybe individuals, so are you saying that sort of our ability to differentiate whether sort of social aging is a compensatory sort of beneficial change, looking at how those social changes align with kind of cortisol changes with age might give us some indication as to, is this actually a beneficial change or not? Or am I misunderstanding still?
Yes, I'm sorry my English, but I can write in your email my question and talk about this.
Yeah,
That
that sounds great. Yeah, so sorry if I'm not quite grasping, but please feel free to email me and I'd be, yeah, happy to chat about it.
very cool. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Juan.
Thanks.
Thank you, Juan. I'm gonna skip myself again and I will call perfect. Or
Perfect.
I'm not sure. We have three, so please make sure to.
Hi everyone. Hi everyone.
Hi.
Yes. My name is Nkululeko Nyao, a station manager of Succulent Karoo Research Station. First of all, I would like to admire the very informative presentation based on the social aging and senescence. I have a question here. I'm not sure. Can you please like bring up your predictions? I think there were 4 of them, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep. Would you like to see them?
Yes, please.
Yeah, give me 1 second and I'll bring them up. Just scrolling through the million slides to find them. There we go. And okay. 6 steps later, we'll get there. Okay, here we go. I think. All right, no, there we go. Yep. Can you see that okay?
Yes, I do see them. I have a question with the first one, that the individuals would interact with the few partners as they age. So my question here is that since you were focusing on the social aging, so I want to understand if the individual they get like into like fewer partners is how like they were distributing themselves. They were distributing themselves in the same age group, or it was based on the kinship or something like that. And also, I want to ask a question based on the age. You talk about if the social like I mean if the individual, I think you talk about the individual, if they get more like aging, like they have like high infection rates, something like that, right? So if something like that, an individual and they like to do they like disperse themselves, something like that. Okay.
Okay,
So
so
my question,
go ahead.
okay, my question like based on that, how the individual like distributing themselves is like they know that the individual who are older, they like to get like high rates of infection. Yeah,
Okay.
that's my
Yeah, so okay, I think I've got your question, but so I'll answer, but then please tell me if I've not quite understood. Oh, sorry, 1 sec. I think my screen's a bit, I'm gonna stop sharing for the moment if that's okay. My screen's
okay.
a bit frozen. I don't know why. Yes, okay. So I think what you're sort of asking about here is this possibility that in some cases, sort of sickness behavior and or sort of social avoidance of infected individuals could change in individual social interactions. So given that older individuals tend to be more sort of susceptible to pathogens, that this sort of lower social connectedness with age could be sort of a consequence of, rather than a sort of proactive response to infectious disease risk, right? That individuals could be sort of moving away from older individuals because they are carrying all of this disease around. Am I sort of getting the right?
Yes, I do hear you. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think there's a couple pieces of evidence that point away from that. So I think showing that older individuals tend to have so older individuals tend to be less social, but they are driving that change, right? So older individuals are approaching fewer partners, but they are continuing to be approached by similar numbers of partners. So it doesn't seem like the social partners are sort of withdrawing from avoiding interacting with the older individuals, you know, for avoidance of disease risk or for other reasons. So I think that seems to suggest that that's not what's going on in this case. But it's obviously still a possibility, but I think our results seem to point toward the fact that individuals are just being more selective in who they interact with, you know, and that also seems to be not in line, you know, if individuals who are sick are just sort of taking themselves out of the population or away from the group, you might expect they interact with fewer individuals, but those interactions would be a bit sort of random or arbitrary. Whereas here they're really focusing in on sort of key partners and they're not being avoided by others. So to me, those are the two pieces of evidence that seem to suggest that that's not what's going on, at least in this population, but it's a totally reasonable hypothesis.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to call Sarah.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Piñeros. I'm from Colombia. I'm finishing my biology degree right now. And first of all, I found like very interesting what you mentioned about like these factors, these other factors that may like affect the senescence, like the immunity ones and the pathogens. So my question is that if there are like any other factors, specifically like environmental factors such as, I don't know, ecosystem disturbance due to climate change or something like that, that also may affect like these networks, the sociality, and well, this survival in these species.
Yeah, so Sarah, I'm just gonna clarify just to be sure I'm answering the right question here. So are you sort of wondering about what are the other potential explanations for social aging? So why change the social behavior with age?
Yes,
Yeah.
like some other factors that may affect, but especially in relation with, for example, the climate change. Yes, like these disturbances that might be presented in some ecosystems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll start by, I'll just share, I'll go back and sort of share one of the slides early on in the talk with you. If I can find it. Okay. So this is maybe just to give you a bit of an overview of, oops, no, not that. What some of the different explanations that we've laid out for social aging are, but then we can maybe try to talk a little bit more specifically about your question, which is maybe not something I've thought super close about. So just to sort of give you a little bit of just a quick rundown of what I've thought about as the main drivers of social aging, which doesn't mean that I haven't, there could be stuff here that I haven't thought of. So I sort of talked about, you know, things like physical deterioration, energetic deterioration, social cognitive decline. All of these things might influence how individuals are behaving socially, you know, might inhibit their ability to socially interact as they get older. We talked a lot about this idea of increased selectivity, so that individuals might be sort of adjusting their behavior in a way that can compensate for these late life declines. So things like compensating for immune decline. There are also things here that I only skimmed over, which also might play a role. So we know things like changing reproductive value. So how much an individual is contributing to the future generations. We know that that changes with age, that it tends to, it almost always declines with age. And so, you know, what an individual's sort of reproductive value is in the population is potentially going to affect how much social effort it's giving and who maybe it's directing that social effort toward. So for instance, you know, we might expect that older individuals are directing their sort of social energy and effort to individuals who are younger relatives who have higher reproductive value. So thinking about changes in reproductive value or reproductive effort might sort of inform how individuals might be adjusting or changing their social effort. Things like enhanced experience, I touched on a little bit. So we can think about sort of increased knowledge or experience that come with age. So you might just be more knowledgeable about how to navigate your social environment or you might just have a lot of information. So we know for killer whales, for example, know where food resources. So females are really important for leading their pods to key food resources. And so that sort of enhanced experience and knowledge might mean that older individuals are really sought out as important partners. And so that could really influence individuals' social interactions, social relationships. And then we also have things like kinship dynamics, which again, I didn't really talk about, but the idea here is that depending on whether you are a philopatric individual, so you remain with your group, or if you're a disperser, influences how your relatedness to your group is likely to change as you age. So, you know, for philopatric individuals, the relatedness remains quite consistent with age. Whereas for a disperser, you enter a new group and then you start contributing offspring to that group. So your relatedness increases with age. And so how related you are to individuals in your group might shape how many social relationships you have, or how widely differentiated or dispersed those social relationships are. So those are the things that I've been thinking about as the main drivers of social aging. But thinking about sort of how sort of climate change might influence social aging patterns. It certainly has the potential, or sort of anthropogenic influence certainly has the potential to be sort of selectively removing individuals from the population, which might play a role it's hard to think. It's hard to think for me to think through at the moment exactly how that would influence sort of an individual's aging trajectory. Other than, you know, again, if we're going back to this discussion about sort of individuals being under greater physiological, you know, stress from you know, hot climates, or what, you know, whatever the sort of environmental variable that we're thinking about might cause faster physiological declines with age, which might influence how social behavior is changing. But I was also trying to think through whether deaths of individuals, sort of selective removal of individuals from populations through things like, you know, trophy hunting, whether that sort of potentially limits individuals' social interactions or who they interact with as they get older. I don't know that I have a clear answer without having without thinking that through a little bit more closely. It's a really interesting question, but I don't know immediately how I would expect that to influence social aging patterns.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. I'll keep thinking on that one.
I'm gonna do like just post a follow-up question on that, because you may have some insights from the CAIO data. So
Yeah.
maybe before and after the major the storm disaster, the social relationships, they change, and we know that they increase tolerance overall. But did you, or have you analyzed probably trajectories of social senescence before and after the event?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question, Adriana. No, I haven't looked at it. I think Irene, who is a fellow postdoc in Lauren's lab, I think this is something that's on her radar. So she's also interested in these social aging questions. Yeah, that she is thinking about looking at. But at the moment, we don't know. But you're totally right that we do, CAIO is a natural system where we've got, you know, the animals experience these hurricanes. And so we have data from many individuals on what their social aging trajectory was before the hurricane and potentially after the hurricane. So yeah, maybe, Sarah, future papers coming to say how that's happened. So I guess I should also say that we do know that experiencing sort of major environmental disturbances, climatic events, can accelerate other patterns of aging, right? So we know from some of the work in the kind of macaques that that's the case, and so I think it's very possible that we would also see faster patterns of social aging, but it's so hard to know because we don't know why social aging occurs exactly. But yeah, to be determined.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so next question comes from Laura.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. I am a biology student at the Universidad del Rosario, and thank you very much for your talk. Well, you mentioned evidence that the groups isolate or exclude the oldest member, but you mentioned that these represent a benefit in reducing cost of a infection. But my question is this an evolutionary strategy to protect the young, considering that they are the ones who ensure the reproduction and the future of the group? Now, we know that it has a benefits, but what the cost does excluding that the oldest member entail for the group?
So I think, Laura, thanks for the question. I think just to be sure we're on the same page. So I think here we don't see evidence actually that individuals are excluding the oldest individuals. Instead, it actually seems like that these older females, that the group members continue to approach them and interact with them at the same rates as they get older. So that hasn't changed. So that doesn't seem to be happening. I know that we sort of were talking a little bit about the possibility that older individuals might be excluded because they carry more disease or because they're just not very desirable partners. But that doesn't seem to be happening in this system, at least.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Laura. Oh, wow. So there's another question from Adeline.
Hello, everyone. My name is Adeline. I am a biology student of Universidad del Rosario. So my question is, have you considered whether individual traits, such as personality or temperament, might influence how individuals experience in social aging?
Yeah, not something I've looked at all. I think actually Carson and I were talking about this earlier. I think it was Carson and I. Anyway, one of us, I was talking with somebody about this earlier. And no, so I don't know. I don't have any clue, but we also know very, very little about inter-individual variation in aging trajectories generally. So I would say that the results that I showed you suggest, and I didn't really touch on this very much, but that there's not a lot of inter-individual variation, that most individuals are sort of showing the same trajectories of declines or not, depending on the social metric with age. So I think that's a starting place. We first need to actually look at, is there individual variation to begin with? And then we can start looking at what might explain that inter-individual variation. And personalities is maybe one thing that is worth considering, but nobody's looked at it yet.
Thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adeline. Next question Juliana, and then again the station. I'm not sure who's going to talk there.
Hi, my name is Juliana. I'm a biology student from Colombia, and I'm very interested in ecology and conservation topics, which is why my question is, could knowledge about social aging be integrated into conservation strategies? For example, by considering the management of aging social groups in captivity or in the wild.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and something that is definitely worth taking into consideration, that we need to be thinking about the fact that if individuals are changing their social behavior as they age, then that might really affect the dynamics of the whole group. And that might, like I was sort of trying to show with all of the sort of network level changes, that might have a lot of implications for, you know, how disease spreads in a population, which might be really important for conservation issues, or, you know, the ability of a group to sort of communicate and coordinate. And so, yeah, I think we do really need to think about how aging shapes the social landscape and how that's going to scale up to not just affect individuals directly, but it's going to affect the whole sort of wider network. So I think it could be a really important piece of sort of thinking about conservation that is worth consideration. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. Okay, our last question, I think, will come from the station.
Hello, everyone. My name is Perfect, and I'm currently doing my master's working at the Circular Recovery Station. I'm currently doing a project on investigating the activity budget of the bush carol rat. So my question is, I wanted to ask, how does social aging sort of differ from other kinds of aging, like for example, physically so, or like if we compare them in terms of how difficult it is for them to adapt to change, you know, when comparing the two different kind of agings.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is the really interesting piece about social aging or behavior generally, right? Is that behavior is enormously flexible. So when we're thinking about, you know, for instance, just to take it out of an aging context for a moment, we're thinking about how an individual can respond to, you know, harsh environments or changing climatic situations. Often individuals are very limited in their ability to adjust their sort of physiology, right, in order to cope with those environments. So if all of a sudden you stick an animal that's not, you know, well adapted to a hot situation in a hot environment, well, it can only sweat so much, or maybe it can't sweat at all, but it can behaviorally do things, right, to seek out shade, or alternately in a cold environment, seek out other partners to allow it to thermoregulate. And so I think we can kind of think about social aging in that same way, that as an individual gets older, we know that there's sort of inevitable physiological declines that, you know, so far we don't know. I know this is not true across all. I know aging is very variable across the animal kingdom, but generally speaking, these sort of inevitable physiological declines. And animals can't really necessarily do anything about that, but social behavior is something that they potentially can do something about. And that's why I think there's this interesting potential for social behavior to differ from these other aspects of aging trajectories, and that individuals might be able to flexibly adjust who they interact with to make the best of a bad job, to compensate for some of these other declines that are inevitable. So that to me is sort of where social aging kind of differs from typical aging trajectories, and maybe has potential to offset some of the negative consequences of aging.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I don't see any other question here, so I'm just gonna close. And first, thank Erin for such a great talk, engaging discussion, and everyone here to attend and participate. And just a reminder, our last talk next week. We'll hope to see you around, and just keep an eye for the schedule for next season. Okay, so I'm gonna stop our live stream. I don't know, Ari, you want to say something before I stop?
Just thanks so much. It's a really engaging discussion. I appreciate all of the questions. So yeah, thanks very much for everyone for attending.